If you have your Bibles, turn to Luke chapter 22. Luke chapter 22. We're going to begin reading today at verse 47. Let me just set the setting for where we're at in this passage. We're in the Garden of Gethsemane. Jesus went to the Mount of Olives to pray, and his disciples followed him, but they've fallen asleep. Jesus is praying. He goes back. His disciples are asleep. He says, "Wake up and pray." He goes back. He's praying again. He walks back out, and they've fallen asleep again. Jesus has just asked them, why are they sleeping? And he tells them, pray so that you may not enter into temptation. And then we come to this passage today in Luke chapter 22, verse 47. It says, "While he was still speaking, there came a crowd, and the man called Judas, one of the 12, was leading them. He drew near to Jesus to kiss him, but Jesus said to him, 'Judas, would you betray the Son of Man with a kiss?' And when those who were around him saw what would follow, they said, 'Lord, shall we strike with the sword?' And one of them struck the servant of the high priest and cut off his right ear. But Jesus said, 'No more of this.' And he touched his ear and healed him. Then Jesus said to the chief priests and officers of the temple and elders who had come out against him, 'Have you come out as against a robber with swords and clubs? When I was with you day after day in the temple, you did not lay hands on me. But this is your hour and the power of darkness.'" This is the last miracle of Jesus before his death and before his resurrection. When you're reading the Gospels, you've got to remember they're writing to different audiences. And so sometimes they will emphasize different things based on who they're writing to. And so to get a good, clear picture of what's going on, you need to look at all four Gospels to see if they discuss something that's going on. This particular event is mentioned in all four Gospels. Matthew and Mark is pretty close to Luke. Luke adds the detail that Jesus healed the ear. But let's look at what John says, because John, it's almost like you're putting a puzzle together, right? There's different pieces in different books. And when we get this, we get a pretty clear picture of what happened. So let's look at John's version of what happened. John 18, beginning at verse 1. "When Jesus had spoken these words, he went out with his disciples across the brook Kidron, where there was a garden, which he and his disciples entered. Now Judas, who betrayed him, also knew the place, for Jesus often met there with his disciples. So Judas, having procured a band of soldiers and some officers from the chief priests and the Pharisees, went there with lanterns and torches and weapons. Then Jesus, knowing all that would happen to him, came forward and said to him, 'Whom do you seek?' They answered him, 'Jesus of Nazareth.' Jesus said to them, 'I am he.' Judas, who betrayed him, was standing with them. When Jesus said to them, 'I am he,' they drew back and fell to the ground." So that was not with a touch. That was not with a wave of a hand. That was with the voice of God that knocked them to the ground in this case. So he asked them again, "Whom do you seek?" And they said, "Jesus of Nazareth." Jesus answered, "I told you that I am he. So if you seek me, let these other men go. Let my disciples go," in other words. "This was to fulfill the word that he had spoken. Of those whom you gave me, I have lost not one." Then Simon Peter, of course it was Simon Peter, having a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's servant and cut off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. So John gives us the identity of the people who are involved in this. Jesus said to Peter, "Put your sword into its sheath. Shall I not drink the cup that the Father has given me?" Of course it was Peter. John's gospel was the very last gospel of the four that was written. You had Mark, you had Matthew, you had Luke, then you had John. And so you wonder, when they're reading this, which of the 12 cut off the ear? I don't think there was ever any doubt or speculation in the meantime before John identified it. I think if you've read the Gospels, you've got a pretty good theory, at least, as to who did it before John's Gospel is written out. I don't think there was probably any question, but John's Gospel makes it very clear. This was Peter who took the sword and cut off the ear. It also tells us the name of the servant whose ear was cut off. His name was Malchus. We have two completely different people in this passage, Peter and Malchus. We have one miracle, we have one God, but it touches two different people in two different ways. And we're going to look at that today. First, let's talk about Malchus. It says he's a servant to the high priest. And when you see that word servant, there's typically a little note in your Bible telling you that it could be translated another way. And that way is bondservant. The word is doulon, which is a form of doulos, and that typically means that they're a slave. We took that word out of our Bibles because people think of back to the 1800s in America, slaves. That's not what the situation was here, but it's clear that he was a slave to the high priest. He likely wasn't in the garden by choice. He was forced to be there. He may not have wanted to be there. He didn't really have a dog in this fight, but here he is. He finds himself in the garden, and he finds himself front and center in the most, hands down, famous arrest in all of history. He plays a front row main character right in this story. There's a standoff in the garden. This slave who has to be there sees this glint in the moonlight, and all of a sudden he feels a pain in his ear. The blow came out of nowhere. Have you ever had something that just comes out of nowhere and leaves you in pain? You ever had something that just paralyzes you? Just comes out of nowhere. You're not expecting it, and it happens, and it paralyzes you. That's where Malchus was. The pain that Malchus felt was totally unexpected. To make matters worse, this pain was inflicted by one of Jesus' disciples. What was Jesus' message the whole time? Love, love, love. Love your neighbor. Love your enemy even. Pray for those who persecute you. You have a person here who's supposed to love Jesus, who's supposed to be loving Malchus, and you have a person who comes in and inflicts this pain. Sometimes we get hurt by people who are supposed to love us the most. It's true. Maybe it's a brother and sister in Christ. Maybe it's the pastor. Maybe it's your wife or husband. Maybe it's your kids, your parents, your brothers, your sisters, your best friends, your boss. People who are supposed to love us, people who we are supposed to be close to, can hurt us. You ever been hurt by someone, whether it's physically or emotionally, who's supposed to love you? Didn't help Malchus's pain one bit that the person who hurt him was supposed to love him. Didn't help his pain at all. He's still standing there. He's still got a hole where his ear should have been. He's still standing there in pain. And here's the reality of the situation. Peter's not that good of a shot with the sword. He did not intend to cut Malchus's ear off. That much is certain. He meant to kill Malchus. He meant to kill him. And I don't know if Malchus saw it and turned. I don't know if he was a bad shot. Remember, he could throw his rod out, right? But maybe he couldn't throw out the sword as well as he could the rod. Whatever happened, He missed, and it hit Malchus's ear, and Malchus's ear fell off. For whatever reason, he missed his head and got his ear, but Peter's intent was to completely destroy this man. Peter's intent was to fight. Peter's intent, he's supposed to love him, but at this moment his intent is to destroy him, to annihilate him. So he swings the sword. He brings this sudden, this unexpected pain to Malchus. It just comes out of nowhere. He leaves Malchus with a hole that cannot be filled. They didn't have modern technology in those days. They're not going and sewing all this up. It was a hole that could not be filled. His ear is gone. And where his ear was, there's nothing left but a hole. Sometimes when people hurt us, there are holes left inside of us. And those holes can't be filled. Some of us have been hurt intentionally even by others. Others who are supposed to love us, but they've inflicted pain and they've left holes that can't be filled. To make matters worse, even after we see Jesus heal Malchus, we don't see Peter go and say, hey man, I'm sorry. Things got out of hand. Hey, I shouldn't have done that. That's against what my masters taught me. Maybe he did, maybe he didn't. It's not listed anywhere in Scripture that Peter did that. This guy may have been sitting around waiting on an apology that never came. Malchus is standing there. I imagine his ear is just bleeding profusely. Most of us saw what happened last summer when a bullet just grazed the ear, how much blood came out of Donald Trump's ear when that assassination attempt happened. Can you imagine if the whole ear is gone? I suspect it would be fairly bloody. Malchus is standing there. He's standing in a crowd of Jews. Most of the crowd is there to arrest Jesus. Only 12 others and Jesus are there. He's standing in the majority, but I imagine at that moment he felt like he's completely alone. Because he's standing there in pain. There's nothing anybody can do for him. He's standing there with this hole that's left, and nobody can fill that hole in the crowd. Everyone is staring at him. They're helpless to do anything. I love how Luke puts what happens next. Luke 22:51. It says, but Jesus. There's no more powerful words in Scripture than those two words. But Jesus. I was in so much pain, but Jesus. I had a wound that couldn't be healed, but Jesus. Someone who was supposed to love me really hurt me. And nobody could fix that hurt but Jesus. Luke says, but Jesus said, no more of this. And he touched his ear and healed him. Jesus said, no more fighting, no more wounding, no more of this. He stopped the violence, and then he stopped the pain. He stepped forward. He reached down into the dirt. He found Malchus's ear, and it says he touched it and put it back on. He healed him completely. He touched it, it says. He healed him. Malchus went from having a hole in his head to having an ear in just a matter of seconds. Maybe you're here today and you're in pain. Maybe you're here today, you have wounds that are old. Someone you love even inflicted those wounds. Someone maybe you never thought would hurt you. Somebody who's not supposed to hurt you, but the wounds are still there. There's still a hole. Let Jesus touch those wounds today. He's the only one that can fill that hole. Let him fill that hole. Maybe your wounds are fresh. Maybe you don't think they're significant enough to bother Jesus with. Let Jesus heal them today. There's nothing too insignificant. We learned from Malchus, nobody is too insignificant. This is a man who was in the garden to kill Jesus. And he's not so insignificant that he can't touch him and heal him in that moment. Nobody is too far gone to experience the healing of Jesus. Malchus was there to arrest Jesus. He knew a trial would come. He knew Jesus would be put on that cross. He was an agent of death coming for Jesus. But what did Jesus do? He had compassion on him. And he reached down into the dirt, into the mess. He got the ear and he put it back on. By healing him, it confirmed his worth in God's eyes. Malchus, you mean something to me. No problem is too big. He wants us to cast all of our cares on him. Whether it's big, whether it's small, he says, cast your cares on me. He reached down into the dirt. He found that ear. He put it back on. Nothing was too big and nobody was too far gone. He's never too busy. Think about all that's going on. I mean, Jesus has just been in the garden. He's praying. He's praying and worrying about what's getting ready to happen. He's stressed about that. It says he stressed so much, he began to sweat drops of blood. I've never been that stressed in my life. Yet that's where Jesus is at. Now the crowd's here. Now they're going to arrest him. Now he knows there's no backing out of this now. I'm on my way to the cross. There's no stopping this. It's all set in motion. All of that's going on in this garden at the time. There's almost a fight between the two parties, but Jesus is not so busy that he can't stop focusing on all of that and focus on this person who's in need right in front of him. We don't read what happened to Malchus after this. Only one more mention is when Peter denies Jesus, and it says that one of the men that accused him, John tells us, was a cousin, a relative of Malchus. Other than that, Malchus is not mentioned anywhere else. We don't know what happened to him. You ever wondered? Ever wondered what the conversation went? I mean, he's probably got blood all over him. He goes home and says, hey, honey, how you doing? How was your night? Well, I got my ear cut off. Which one? Why is there blood on your shirt? Well, I got my ear cut off. Your ear seems fine to me. Little questioning maybe by the wife. What weird thing were you doing out there today? Why aren't you telling me? We don't know what happened. Did he become a follower of Christ? I don't know. I don't know how you could experience the touch of God like that and not become a follower of Christ, but unfortunately we see it happen quite a bit in today's society. I've run through all those scenarios in my head. What happened to Malchus? Did he harbor hate for Peter for the rest of his life, for what Peter had done for those few moments that he was in excruciating pain? Did he threaten revenge on Peter? He could have picked up the ear and used it as a souvenir and said, hey, here's what Peter did to me. This guy who's preaching to you on the day of Pentecost, here's what he did to me. Here's my ear. Here's the hole in my head. He could have used that as a trophy, but instead he let Jesus heal it. You notice that Malchus never picks up a sword and goes after Peter. He doesn't try to get revenge. Some of us get obsessed with revenge and we want to go after the one that hurt us. And that's just a principle of life. When we hurt, we want somebody else to hurt. We have to let God bless us. We have to let God heal us. We have to let Him fill that hole, because if we try to fill it with something else, we're going to see that it's not working. We're going to see that it doesn't work. People try to fill that hole in them all the time with drugs or alcohol or pain pills. We see all of these things, sexual encounters, success, money, power. We see people trying to fill holes all the time. It doesn't work. Only Jesus can fill that hole. When God touched Malchus, Malchus released the wound. He forgot about the hurt. He didn't seek the revenge. He let Jesus touch the hurt and the hole and heal it. We don't need to get even. We need to let Jesus heal us. Now let's shift gears. Let's look at Peter. Peter's on the other side of the battle, right? He's the one wielding the sword. He's standing with Jesus. Peter did some awesome things throughout the Gospels. He walked away from a probably successful fishing business to follow Jesus. He walked away from that. He left everything behind. He left his wife at home to follow Jesus. We know he was married because Jesus healed his mother-in-law. He walks away from that. He leaves her behind to follow Jesus. Think about Peter's faith. Who was the first person to say, "You are the Christ, the Messiah"? It was Peter. Jesus asked the disciples, he said, "Who do people say that I am?" They said, "Well, some people think you're John the Baptist. Some people think you're Elijah. Some people think that you're Jeremiah or maybe one of those other prophets." He said, "Who do you say that I am?" Peter said this, "You are the Christ, the Son of God." Peter had huge faith. I preached on this a few Sunday nights ago. Remember, the storm comes up. A ghost is walking on the water. That's what they think. Until they call out to him and he answers. And Peter says, "Hey, if that's you, Jesus, let me walk out to you." Peter's the only one of the 12 who had the faith to get out of the boat and walk on the water. But for all Peter's strength, he has weaknesses. And you do too. And I do too. Every one of us has strengths and weaknesses. Just a few verses after Jesus proclaimed him as the Messiah, Jesus began to tell the disciples, he said, "I've got to be killed, and in 3 days I'm going to be raised again." And when Jesus said this, Peter said, "I don't even think so. That's not the way this works. That's not the way that the Messiah is supposed to happen." He began to pull Jesus aside, and he rebuked Jesus. Can you imagine that? He said, "Quit saying that. That's not the way this is going to go." And Matthew 16:23 records what Jesus said to him. It says, "But he turned and said to Peter, 'Get behind me, Satan. You are a hindrance to me, for you are not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man.'" How many times are we so focused on our problems, our issues, our view of how we think things ought to go, that we forget about the things of God? Peter's big weakness is he thought he knew better than God. He thought he knew better than Jesus. This isn't how that's supposed to go, Jesus. He thought his ways were better than God's ways. He thought his plans were better than God's plans. We see it in the Garden of Gethsemane. The band of Jews come in to arrest Jesus. And Luke tells us, Luke 22:49, his followers asked, "Jesus, Lord, shall we strike with the sword?" They asked him that. I don't know who asked it, but I know who didn't. Peter. Because he already had his sword unsheathed and was striking. Because he thought he knew the plan. He didn't ask. He didn't wait for Jesus to answer. He had the human answer in his hands. So he takes it out and he strikes. He took matters into his own hands. He's shocked. He's scared. He's just absolutely terrified of what's about to happen. And he takes matters into his own hands and he acted on impulse. Surely none of us have ever done something like that. We give Peter a hard time, but let's give him a little bit of grace here, okay? It's been a long day. It's been a long day. They've had a very busy day. Things going on. Then they have the Passover dinner. That's huge. You get your belly full. Think about Thanksgiving. What's the next thing? Watch football and take a nap, right? It's the only reason you watch football. It puts you to sleep. He's had a huge meal, and Jesus says, hey, here's what we're going to do. We're going to go up to the garden and we're going to pray. You know what time it is, God? It's a couple hours past my bedtime already. Jesus, you sure about this? Yeah, come on, we're going to pray. Why do you think he fell asleep? He was exhausted. He was exhausted in the garden. He's tired. Let's give him some grace. Jesus even comes in. He wakes him up. He says, hey, wake up, pray. Now you're getting called out by the master. You're going to do your best to stay awake if you think that's the Son of God, the Messiah. But he just can't do it. They falls asleep again. He's exhausted. He's worn out. He's shocked. He's scared. He doesn't know what's going to happen. And so he tries to fix the situation. The irony of this is that if you look just a little bit earlier in Luke, just a few verses earlier, it says they have 2 swords among 12 people. You've got a group of a lot of men, and it says that they're all armed with clubs and swords. Matthew tells us it's a great crowd with swords and clubs. You've got a great crowd, you've got 2 armed disciples, and they really thought they were going to take on this armed crowd and win. That's how grand we think our plans are compared to how grand God's plans usually are. He's outnumbered, he's outmatched, he doesn't have the weapons, and he doesn't have the power to keep this from happening. Jesus has the power, but he doesn't. He takes out his sword, he attacks, he does a poor job of attacking. He can't even get one of them. He misses, he cuts off the ear. How many times do we take matters into our own hands and we miss? How many times do we need to wait on God, but we're in too big of a hurry and we miss? Boy, that happens a lot at my house because I have teenagers. Right? Dad, can you help me with this? I can't right now, I'm busy. Let me help you with it tomorrow. Oh no, tomorrow's an eternity away. So they take matters into their own hands. Maybe it's not even my 2 boys, maybe it's my 4-year-old. That may be even more likely. She takes matters into her own hands. And what always happens? Catastrophe. Dad, can you get me some milk? I can't right now. Next thing I know, crash. Here comes the milk on the floor. How many times do we do that in our lives? We can't wait on God, but I can do it. Ellie used to say, "It okay, I do it." That was a famous quote. "It okay, I do it." He tries to fix the situation. Peter missed. Now the situation's tenser than it was because you got a guy on the other side. He's bleeding. He's got a hole in his head. Things are a whole lot tenser than they were at that moment. A battle's about to break out now, and it's going to be a slaughter. But Jesus intervened in the situation. Jesus calmed the situation. He stopped the things that were spiraling out of control. Jesus took charge in this storm that was brewing, and Peter didn't have the strength or energy to stop it, but Jesus stepped in and he calmed the situation. Matthew tells us in Matthew 26:52, then Jesus said to Peter, put your sword back in its place. For all who take the sword will perish by the sword. Do you think that I cannot appeal to my Father, and He will at once send me more than 12 legions of angels? How then should the Scriptures be fulfilled that it must be so? Jesus said, put your sword away, Peter. There's a bigger plan in play. It's not about your plan right now. It's about my plan. And I've made the decision. I've sweat blood in the garden. While you were asleep, Peter, I sweat blood in the garden. And I've come to this decision. This is the only way. I've said, Father, if there's any other way, let this cup pass. Nevertheless, not my will, but your will be done. He said, this is the only way, Peter. Despite what you think you know is best for me, despite what you think is best for you, my Heavenly Father knows what's best, and this is the only way. Peter, this exhausted and loyal disciple, he believed that Jesus needed help to prevent his arrest, but Jesus corrected him in the moment. Jesus had all kinds of help available to him. He had the Father standing right by. He had 12 legions of angels, he said. I could call them. We saw in John, he just spoke and they all fell down. Jesus could have got out of this at any time. If Jesus had wanted to prevent his death on the cross, he didn't need Peter's little sword to do it. He could have done it on his own. All the angels from heaven would have come in of an instant if he'd just said the word. Scripture had to be fulfilled. Jesus had to go to the cross and drink the cup that the Father had given him. There were bigger plans in place. Jesus submitted to the Father's plan. He let himself be apprehended. He let himself be crucified to fulfill Scripture and pay for the sins of the world. Peter, who at that time, Matthew tells us, had merely human concerns in mind, tried to prevent the arrest with violence. Peter's earthly perspective, his fear, his exhaustion, all of those things clouded his judgment the whole rest of the night. He'd go on to deny Jesus 3 times. When we look at things from our perspective, when we look at things through our eyes instead of God's plan and God's perspective, it's going to cloud our judgment and it's going to lead us into sin. God, why are you doing this to me? God, why are you allowing this to happen to me? All of those questions lead to one place: doubt and sin. When we see it from His perspective, when we look at His plan rather than taking things into our own plan, that's when awesome things begin to happen. Peter thought his plan was better than God's. He thought his way was better than God's way. Peter was taking a stand for Jesus, but he was doing it in the wrong way and in the wrong spirit, and it ended up bringing hurt to someone who was completely innocent. He didn't want to be in the garden that night. He was told to be in the garden that night. He was only there because he had to be. He had done absolutely nothing wrong. He was just in the wrong place and in the wrong time. And how many times do we, as followers of Christ, when we take matters into our own hands, how many times do we take a stand in the wrong way and with the wrong spirit, and we end up hurting people who are innocent bystanders? I just don't get God and all these things that He's doing. And you're telling that to somebody who's an unbeliever. They're not going to get God then. They're not going to understand what He's doing. Because you are God to them. Not that you're God, but that's who they see. When they see you, they see Him. Our tongues become like swords. We say ugly, we say cutting things to people. Sometimes our motives are like swords, and we just want to maim or injure somebody. We want to destroy. We don't want to build. Sometimes our actions become like swords. We react rashly. Just like he did with Peter, Jesus has to step in. And Jesus has to heal the hurt and the pain, because outside of that, nothing else will work. We got a whole generation of people who are doing what they call deconstructing right now. You say, what's that mean? That means they're not attending church. That means they're reshaping their whole belief on God. That means that they're questioning whether God even exists. Why are they doing it? Because somebody in the church thought that their way was better than God's way and hurt that person, and they've had to step out. That's it. We have a whole generation who have been hurt, who are backing away from the thing that can fix them, the thing that can heal them. They're running in the opposite direction from that. And it's not because of a loving God, it's because of church people who took things into their own hands. Jesus would not tolerate so much as the loss of an ear in his defense. He said, enough of this. Listen, we think we need to defend Jesus. Jesus doesn't need our defense. He's made it just fine for 2,000 years. He'll make it if this world lasts another 2,000. The only blood shed was going to be his own. He said, enough of this. And he intervened in the life of Malchus. Malchus didn't ask Jesus to heal him. Jesus just reached down, picked up the ear, and put it back on his head. And instantly those wounds and that hurt was gone. See, we can visualize the effect that this miracle had on Malchus. We can picture, I've never had my ear chopped off. I can imagine it would hurt. I suspect they would put you under anesthesia to remove an ear these days. I don't think they'd just, here's a stick, bite it when it hurts. No, I don't think that's what would happen today. Why? Because it's going to hurt. You're going to punch the doctor or something. They don't like that. We can picture this. We can picture him in pain standing there. We can picture Jesus reaching down in all the dirt, and I don't know if he had to search for it. Oh, nope, that's just a leaf. Here it is, I got it. Yeah. He put it back on his head. We can picture that. There was a hole, there was blood, now there's an ear. There's still blood because it didn't, just dissolve. But it's not bleeding from the ear, it's just stained on the clothes. Picture that, can't we? You know what we can't picture? The miracle in Peter's life. You say, what miracle is that? When Peter stepped forward, when Peter swung his sword as somebody who's a representative of the high priest, Peter broke the law. Peter has now attempted to kill somebody who is a representative of the highest person in the nation of Israel. There's going to be punishment for that. There's going to be something that happens to Peter. When the men first entered the garden to arrest Jesus, he said, "Who are you looking for?" He said, "If you're looking for me, let all these other people go." He'd made a deal. They were all going to walk away, but now the situation has changed. Peter took matters into his own hand. Peter has struck the ear of somebody on the other side, and there's going to be punishment that comes from that. A crime has been committed. At the very least, Peter's going to get flogged. At the very most, he's going to be hanging right next to Jesus on the cross. But this one miracle has another effect. Jesus steps in. He picks up that ear. He puts it on Malchus. Can Malchus now go to court and say, "He cut my ear off"? You have two, looks like to me. Jesus stepped in and he removed all evidence of guilt of Malchus. He removed it all. But Jesus intervened. Peter's going to jail. Peter's going to maybe his death or at least a beating. But Jesus intervened. Jesus wiped the slate clean for Peter. This man's committed no crime that I see. It's the same thing he does for us. It's the reason he had to go forward in the garden. It's the reason he didn't let them fight a battle. It's what he does for us today when we think our plans are better than God's plans. When we don't wait, when we're impatient, when we hurt innocent people, when we sin, he takes all that evidence of the sin against us and he picks it up and he casts it as far as the east is from the west. And it's gone in our life. There's no evidence that a crime has committed again. And if we sin again, we ask him for forgiveness, and he picks it up again, and he casts it as far as the east is from the west. And he does it just as many times as we need the grace and we need the mercy. Peter got a benefit from this miracle too. Peter got a clean slate, and we get a clean slate as well. Jesus surrendered himself in that garden. He went on to face the humiliation. He went on to face the pain of a beating. He went on to be crucified on the cross and shed that blood for you and for me so that we can have a miracle just like Peter's. This one miracle, the last miracle of Jesus before he died on the cross, had an effect not just on Malchus, but also on Peter. Both of them were affected. Malchus had his wounds healed. Malchus had his pain stopped. Malchus was touched in an instant from the pain inflicted by somebody who was supposed to love him, but instead struck out and lashed out at him, hurting him. But Peter got a benefit too. Peter got a clean slate. All that evidence was wiped away. He could no longer be convicted. He could no longer be punished because of the act that he committed. Jesus took Peter's transgression, he took his rebellion, and he got rid of all the evidence. One miracle, two benefits. One Jesus. I don't know where you are today. Maybe you're in the shoes of Malchus. Maybe somebody's hurt you. Maybe it's somebody in the church. Maybe it's me. Maybe it's a loved one. Maybe it's a relative. Maybe it was somebody you love or somebody who's at least supposed to love you. Maybe it was a follower of Christ. You know, people get hurt all the time. You're hurting. You have a gaping hole. There's just wounds that are not going to be filled. You're standing in a crowd and you don't think anybody can do anything about it. But Jesus. But Jesus. Jesus is ready to heal your hurt. Jesus is ready to fill that hole. Jesus is ready to heal those wounds. Or maybe today you're in the shoes of Peter. Maybe you think that you know better than God's way. God, this is my plan and I'm sticking to it. Anybody like that? Anybody ever like that when you're driving? I punch my map in, but I know better than my map. I'm not going that way. That's going to take me longer. Every time I do that, I've got a way that's going to go shorter. Every single time I do that, it takes me longer than what the map says. Because the map knows the whole situation. The map these days can tell you there's a traffic jam up here. You're going to have to sit on the highway for 2 hours. And you may think that's the quickest way, but I'm taking you around these curvy, hilly roads because that's the quickest way. That's the way it is with God. We don't always know better. He may take us a detour. He may take us around twisty, hilly roads, but He knows best. Maybe that's us. We think, man, God, I wanted to go I-44 all the way to Springfield. He took me down to 60. Why is He doing this? Maybe we can't see the big picture. We're exhausted. We're worn out. We're tired. We're ready for an outcome. We're ready for a conclusion. We're lashing out maybe in our confusion, our exhaustion, our anger. But God's ready. If you stay in that anger, if you stay in that hurt, if you stay in that confusion, it's going to cloud your judgment and it's going to lead to sin. I'm here to tell you that. You've got to let it go. You've got to give it to God. You've got to forgive those people that hurt you. You've got to give everything to Jesus and let Him heal it. Let Him fix that hole. Let Him take all the guilt. Let Him give you that peace that passes all understanding. Only He can do it. Jesus restored Peter after He rose from the dead. And you would think that Peter committed the ultimate mess up, that Peter was disqualified from serving, but guess who stepped out of the crowd and preached the message on the day of Pentecost? It was Peter. And he preached with power, and a lot of souls were saved that day. Jesus is waiting this morning. He's waiting to heal. He's waiting to restore. He has a plan. He knows your plan. He knows what's best. He knows He's wanting to forgive you. He's wanting to help you. He's wanting to fill that hole. He's here this morning, waiting on you.